The desert wind carried dust and secrets through the small Arizona town of Redemption Springs, a place where the past never quite stayed buried and the future arrived on horseback with a loaded gun. Jake, Apache Thornton, had earned his nickname not from any native blood, but from the way he moved through the world, silent, observant, and deadly when circumstances demanded it. He'd spent the last 15 years as a tracker and occasional lawman, keeping his distance from anything that resembled permanence or emotional attachment. That careful arrangement of his life shattered on a Tuesday afternoon when Sarah Mitchell spoke 6 words that would haunt him for days to come. Jake had been repairing the fence line at the edge of town when he noticed smoke rising from the Mitchell property. Sarah's husband, Thomas, had died 6 months earlier in a mining accident, leaving her alone with a struggling ranch and more debts than assets. Being neighborly in these parts wasn't optional, it was survival, so Jake had taken to checking on the widow when his conscience wouldn't let him sleep. He told himself it was simple Christian duty, nothing more complicated than that, though the tightness in his chest whenever he saw her suggested his heart had different ideas. The smoke turned out to be nothing serious, just Sarah burning old papers in a barrel behind the barn. She stood there in a simple cotton dress, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, looking simultaneously fragile and impossibly strong. The afternoon sun painted everything gold, and for a moment Jake forgot why he'd ridden over in such a hurry. Sarah smiled when she saw him, that gentle expression that made something crack open inside his carefully guarded soul. They talked about ordinary things at first: the weather, the cattle, the upcoming church social dancing around the electric current that hummed between them whenever they occupied the same space. Then Sarah did something unexpected. She stepped closer, close enough that Jake could smell the lavender soap she used, and looked up at him with eyes that held questions and answers he wasn't prepared to consider. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, intimate and vulnerable in a way that made his pulse hammer. "Do you desire me, Jake?" The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to take back, impossible to ignore. "Because I find myself thinking about you at night, wondering if a widow has any right to want things she shouldn't want." Jake felt the world tilt sideways. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to run, to mount his horse and ride until the confusion in his head settled into something manageable. He'd built his entire adult life around avoiding exactly this kind of complication. Love meant loss. He'd learned that lesson when his family died during the war, when everyone he'd ever cared about turned to memory and regret. Sarah represented everything dangerous: hope, connection, the terrifying possibility of happiness. His hands trembled as he took a step backward, putting distance between them like a man backing away from a cliff edge. "Sarah, The words stuck in his throat, half-formed protests and denials that tasted like lies. Of course he desired her. He'd been fighting that truth for months, maybe longer, pretending his frequent visits were about duty when they were really about the way his heart settled into a different rhythm whenever she was near. But admitting that felt like stepping into quicksand, like volunteering for a kind of vulnerability he'd sworn off years ago. The Apache in him, the tracker, the survivor, knew better than to get tangled up in feelings that could destroy him. He watched hurt flash across Sarah's face as he struggled with his answer, saw her chin lift with defensive pride even as moisture gathered at the corners of her eyes. She'd taken a tremendous risk asking that question, exposing her own loneliness and need, and his silence was answer enough. Jake opened his mouth to explain, to tell her that the problem wasn't her but him, that he was too broken and too afraid to be what she deserved. Before he could form the words, the sound of galloping horses interrupted them. 3 riders appeared over the ridge, moving fast and purposeful toward the Mitchell ranch. Jake's hand dropped instinctively to his gun belt as he recognized the lead rider, Cyrus Blackwood, a land speculator who'd been circling Redemption Springs like a vulture for the past year. Blackwood had made his fortune buying up struggling properties for pennies on the dollar, often using intimidation and worse to encourage reluctant sellers. Jake had suspected the man might eventually target Sarah's land, which sat on a valuable water source, but he'd hoped to have more time to help her sort out her financial situation. Blackwood reined in his horse with theatrical flair, flanked by 2 men who looked more like thugs than ranch hands. His smile was all teeth and no warmth as he tipped his hat to Sarah, Mrs. Mitchell, what a pleasure. I was just passing through and thought I'd check whether you'd reconsidered my generous offer for your property. His eyes slid to Jake with calculated dismissal. Apache, I heard you were spending considerable time out here. Doing charity work, are we? The insult in Blackwood's tone was clear. The implication designed to embarrass both Jake and Sarah. Jake felt anger rise hot in his chest, the kind of rage that had gotten him into trouble when he was younger and less controlled. His reputation as Apache came from more than just tracking skills. It came from a certain ruthlessness when pushed, a willingness to meet violence with greater violence. He'd been trying to outrun that part of himself for years, to be something better than the weapon the war had forged him into. Sarah stepped forward before Jake could respond, her voice steady despite the obvious threat Blackwood represented. My answer hasn't changed, Mr. Blackwood. This land belonged to my husband, and now it belongs to me. It's not for sale at any price. Her hands were clenched at her sides, knuckles white with tension, but her spine was straight as iron. Jake felt something shift inside him, watching her face down 3 armed men without flinching. This woman wasn't just someone he desired, she was someone worth fighting for, worth risking the careful isolation he'd wrapped around his heart. Blackwood's expression hardened, the pretense of civility dropping away like a discarded mask. That's unfortunate, Mrs. Mitchell. Very unfortunate indeed. You see, I've purchased the note on your mortgage from the bank. Seems you're 3 months behind on payments, and the terms stipulate that I can foreclose with 30 days' notice. Consider yourself noticed. He pulled a folded document from his jacket and tossed it at her feet, a gesture calculated to humiliate. Of course, if you were willing to sell voluntarily, I might be persuaded to offer better terms than foreclosure would bring. Jake moved before conscious thought could stop him, putting himself between Sarah and the mounted men. His hand rested on his gun, not threatening exactly, but making clear he was prepared for whatever came next. The lady said, "No, Blackwood." "Time for you to ride on?" The Apachean was fully awake now, calculating distances and angles, reading the tells and how Blackwood's hired guns shifted their weight in their saddles. Violence hung in the air like heat shimmer, one wrong word away from exploding into gunfire and blood. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Blackwood laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Careful, Apache. A man could get himself killed defending something that doesn't belong to him. 30 days, Mrs. Mitchell, then this land becomes mine one way or another." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his companions following, leaving nothing but dust and dread in their wake. Jake stood frozen, aware that everything had changed in the space of a few minutes. Sarah's whispered questions still hung between them unanswered, but now it was tangled up with danger and responsibility and the kind of complications he'd spent years avoiding. He felt her hand touch his arm, tentative and searching, and knew he was already lost. The fight he'd been running from his entire life had finally caught up with him, and he was discovering he didn't want to run anymore. Jake didn't sleep that night. He sat on the porch of his small cabin on the outskirts of Redemption Springs, watching stars wheel across the desert sky while his mind churned through memories he usually kept locked away. Sarah's question, "Do you desire me?" kept echoing in his head, mixed up with images of Blackwood's threatening smile and the very real danger the widow now faced. He'd walked away from her ranch yesterday without giving her an answer, mumbling something about needing to think, and the coward's retreat sat in his stomach like bad whiskey. The truth was complicated in ways Jake had trouble putting into words. He'd been alone so long that desire felt like a foreign language, something he'd once spoken fluently but had almost forgotten. After the war, after watching his parents' farm burn with them inside it during a Confederate raid, after losing the woman he'd planned to marry to cholera, Jake had made himself into something hard and impenetrable. The nickname Apache came from a Pinkerton agent he'd worked with who said Jake moved like a ghost with a grudge, tracking outlaws across impossible terrain with single-minded determination. He'd become exactly what that job required, a man without attachments, without vulnerabilities, without the soft places where grief could take root. Then Sarah Mitchell arrived in Redemption Springs 3 years ago with her husband Thomas, and Jake's carefully constructed isolation started showing cracks. She had a way of seeing past the hard exterior to whatever remained of his humanity. She'd bring him pie for no reason, ask his opinion on things that didn't matter. smile at him after church services like his presence made her day brighter. He told himself she was just being friendly, that married women were safe to be around precisely because the relationship had clear boundaries. When Thomas died, those boundaries evaporated, and Jake found himself drawn to Sarah's property with increasing frequency, making excuses about checking fences or scaring off coyotes when really he just wanted to be near her. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jake made a decision. He couldn't protect Sarah if he didn't know exactly what they were dealing with, and that meant understanding Blackwood's legal position and financial leverage. It also meant confronting some of his own demons, particularly his fear of losing another person he cared about. The Apache way, the way he'd survived for 15 years, was to avoid caring altogether. But Sarah had slipped past his defenses, and now he had to figure out how to be both the man who could keep her safe and the man who might deserve her affection. He rode into town as the sun climbed higher, heading straight for the office of Benjamin Porter, the closest thing Redemption Springs had to a lawyer. Porter was an old drunk who'd lost his practice in Philadelphia after some scandal involving embezzled funds, but he still knew more about contracts and property law than anyone else within 50 miles. Jake found him in his cluttered office above the general store, nursing coffee that smelled like it had been fortified with something stronger. Porter listened while Jake explained the situation, his roomy eyes sharpening with professional interest despite his disheveled appearance. "Blackwood's been buying up debt all over the territory," Porter said, shuffling through papers until he found what he was looking for. "Started about 18 months ago. He's smart about it, waits until properties are struggling, purchases the mortgage from banks who want the bad debt off their books, then forecloses or pressures owners to sell at fire sale prices. Perfectly legal, unfortunately, though morally repugnant." Jake's jaw tightened. What about the Mitchell property? Is there any way to challenge the foreclosure? He was prepared to use his savings if necessary, though he suspected what he'd managed to put away wouldn't be nearly enough to satisfy a mortgage debt. Tracking work paid well enough for a simple life, but it didn't generate the kind of money that could save a struggling ranch. Porter pulled out a ledger and made some calculations, his pencil scratching across paper while Jake tried to contain his impatience. "The original mortgage was for $1,200, Porter finally said. "With interest and penalties for missed payments, Sarah probably owes close to $1,500 now. That's more than this property would sell for at auction, which is why Blackwood's willing to offer her a private sale. He'd likely give her $200 or $300 and take the land clear. From his perspective, it's generous. From hers, it's losing everything her husband worked for. $1,500 might as well have been $15,000 for all that Jake could produce that kind of money quickly. His savings amounted to maybe $300, accumulated slowly over years of careful living. He sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of impossible mathematics pressing down on him. How much time do we really have? Blackwood said 30 days. The foreclosure notice is legitimate, Porter confirmed. But there are always procedures, paperwork, legal requirements. I could probably stretch it to 60 days, maybe 90 if I file the right objections and motions. That assumes Blackwood doesn't get impatient and try more direct methods. The lawyer's expression turned grave. Men like him don't like being told no, Jake. You're putting yourself in his crosshairs by getting involved. Jake stood, his decision already made even if the path forward remained unclear. I've been in crosshairs before. Tell me what you need to slow down the foreclosure, and I'll get it. He pulled out money to pay Porter's fee, knowing the old drunk would work harder with cash in hand. As he turned to leave, the lawyer called out one more thing. There's talk around town, Jake, about you and the widow Mitchell. People notice when a man like you starts paying particular attention to a specific property. Porter's tone wasn't judgmental, just factual. Blackwood will have heard the same talk. He'll use it if he can, try to embarrass her or pressure you through her. Just wanted you to know what you're walking into. The warning settled over Jake like morning frost. In a small town like Redemption Springs, privacy was a luxury nobody could afford. Every visit to Sarah's ranch, every moment they'd spent in conversation, had been noted and cataloged by curious neighbors. The thought made him angry not at the gossips, but at himself for being careless enough to expose Sarah to speculation and judgment. A widow's reputation was fragile enough without having it linked to a man with his rough reputation. He found Sarah at the general store, buying supplies with what looked like the last of her available credit. She saw him and went still, her eyes searching his face for answers to questions she hadn't asked again since yesterday. Jake felt his heart kick hard against his ribs. In the clear morning light, with worry etched around her eyes and determination in the set of her shoulders, she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. The realization terrified him. "We need to talk," he said quietly, aware of the storekeeper pretending not to listen while he tallied up her purchases. "Somewhere private." Sarah nodded and finished her transaction, accepting the wrapped parcels with practiced efficiency. They walked together to her wagon, maintaining the careful distance of people who were intensely aware of each other's presence but trying not to show it. Once they were away from the center of town, heading back toward her ranch, Sarah finally spoke. "You don't owe me anything, Jake. I shouldn't have asked you what I asked yesterday. It was forward of me, inappropriate for a woman who's barely through her mourning period." Her voice was steady, but her hands twisted in her lap, betraying her nervousness. "You don't have to help with Blackwood either. I'll figure something out." Jake pulled his horse alongside her wagon, close enough to see the pride and pain warring in her expression. This was the moment he'd been dreading and anticipating since dawn, the point where he had to be honest about feelings he barely understood himself. The Apache in him wanted to deflect, to turn everything into practical strategy and tactical planning. But Sarah deserved better than his usual emotional cowardice. "Yes," he said simply. The word hung between them, insufficient and enormous at the same time. "Yes, I desire you. I've been fighting it for months, telling myself I had no right to feel that way about Thomas's widow, about a woman who deserves better than what I am. But the truth is, I think about you constantly. I ride out to your place looking for excuses to see you, and when I'm not there, I'm counting the hours until I can justify another visit. So yes, Sarah, the answer to your question is yes." He watched her absorb his words, saw hope and fear chase across her features like cloud shadows on the desert floor. Her eyes filled with tears that she blinked away impatiently, and when she spoke, her voice was rough with emotion. "Then why did you walk away yesterday? Why did it take Blackwood threatening me to bring you back?" It was a fair question, one that cut straight to the core of who Jake had become over the last 15 years. "Because I'm a coward," he admitted, the words tasting like ash. "Because everyone I've ever loved has died, and the thought of opening myself up to that kind of loss again makes me want to run for the hills. Because you deserve someone whole, someone who knows how to build a life instead of just surviving one, and I don't know if I'm capable of being that person." Sarah pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face him fully, her dark eyes intense and unwavering. "You think you're the only one who's afraid? I watched my husband die in my arms, Jake." The mind collapse crushed his chest, and all I could do was hold him while he suffocated. I told myself I'd never risk that kind of pain again, that I'd live out my days alone and safe from heartbreak. Then you came along with your careful distance and your wounded eyes, and I found myself wanting to risk everything all over again. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way that made Jake's throat tighten. He dismounted and walked to the wagon, reaching up to take her hand. Her fingers trembled in his grip, small and work-roughened and perfect. "I don't know how to promise you anything," he said carefully. "I don't know if I can be the man you need. But I know I'm not walking away from you again, and I'm not letting Blackwood or anyone else hurt you. That's going to have to be enough for now." Sarah climbed down from the wagon, and suddenly they were standing close enough that Jake could count the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "That's enough," she whispered, and then she was in his arms, her head against his chest, and Jake felt something unlock inside him that he'd kept frozen for too many years. He held her carefully like something precious and breakable, and let himself imagine a future that contained more than loneliness and regret. They stood that way for a long moment before practicality reasserted itself. Jake reluctantly stepped back, though he kept hold of her hand. "I talked to Benjamin Porter this morning. He's going to file paperwork to slow down the foreclosure, buy us some time. But we need money, Sarah, more money than I've got saved. Is there anything you haven't told me about your financial situation? Any assets or family who might help?" Sarah shook her head, her expression turning bleak. Thomas's family disowned him when he married me. They thought he was marrying beneath his station. My own parents died when I was young. The ranch is mortgaged to the hilt. The cattle herd is barely sustainable, and I owe money to half the merchants in town. I've been selling off equipment and furniture just to buy food. There's nothing left to sell except the land itself. Jake thought hard, running through options and discarding them as quickly as they occurred to him. He could try to organize the other ranchers, pool resources, to help Sarah keep her property, but most of them were struggling themselves. The bank wouldn't extend additional credit to someone already in default. Blackwood had structured things perfectly, leaving no obvious way out of the trap he'd set. Unless... The water rights, Jake said suddenly, an idea taking shape. Your property sits on Redemption Creek, which feeds half the ranches in this valley during dry season. If Blackwood forecloses, he controls that water source. The other ranchers might not care about your mortgage, but they'll damn sure care about who controls their water access. He started pacing, his mind working through the angles. If we can convince them that Blackwood plans to charge for water or cut off access entirely, they might be motivated to help you keep the property. Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. Do you think he would do that? Charge for water access? The question was almost naive. Of course Blackwood would exploit any advantage he gained. That was how men like him operated, turning basic necessities into profit opportunities regardless of who suffered. I think he'd do whatever makes him the most money, Jake replied grimly. And I think the other ranchers know that too. We need to call a meeting, make the case that your fight is their fight. It's a long shot, but it might be our only shot. He paused, considering the risks. Blackwood won't take kindly to us organizing against him. Things could get dangerous. Sarah squeezed his hand, her jaw set with determination. I'm not afraid of dangerous, Jake. I'm afraid of losing the last thing Thomas left me, afraid of being run off land we bled for. If there's a chance to fight back, I'll take it. She met his eyes squarely. And I'm glad you'll be fighting beside me. Jake felt the weight of that trust settle over him like a mantle. He'd spent so long avoiding responsibility for anything beyond his own survival that the sensation was both foreign and strangely right. He nodded slowly, sealing the commitment. Then we better get to work. We've got 60 days to save your ranch and maybe 90 days before Blackwood decides to skip the legal niceties and try something more direct. The Apache in me says we should be prepared for both. They spent the rest of the afternoon planning their strategy, sitting at Sarah's kitchen table surrounded by papers and maps. Jake found himself relaxing into the domestic intimacy of the moment, the way Sarah made coffee without asking if he wanted any, the comfortable silences between their conversations, the sense of partnership that felt natural despite how new it was. This, he realized, was what he'd been running from all these years. Not the risk of loss, but the vulnerability of connection, the terrifying possibility that life could be more than just endurance. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of amber and rose, Jake prepared to ride back to his cabin. Sarah walked him to his horse, and they stood together in the gathering dusk, neither quite willing to end the day. "Thank you," Sarah said softly, "for being honest with me this morning, for not running away again." Jake touched her cheek gently, marveling at his own boldness. "I'm still scared," he admitted. "Still fighting myself every step of the way. But you're worth the fight, Sarah, whatever happens with Blackwood, whatever comes next. I need you to know that." He leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, chaste and promising at the same time. Then he mounted his horse before his courage could fail him, riding off into the twilight with his heart hammering and his mind already planning the battle ahead. The meeting Jake organized took place 3 days later in the back room of the Last Chance Saloon, Redemption Springs' largest watering hole and informal community center. He'd spent those 3 days riding from ranch to ranch, making his case to every property owner in the valley. Some listened with obvious skepticism. Jake, Apache, Thornton wasn't known for community involvement, and his sudden interest in Sarah Mitchell's problems raised eyebrows. But when he explained how Blackwood's control of Redemption Creek would affect their own water access, pragmatism overcame suspicion. By Saturday evening, 17 ranchers crowded into the smoke-filled room, along with a handful of merchants who depended on the ranching community for their livelihoods. Sarah sat near the front, the only woman present, her spine straight despite the weight of so many eyes evaluating her situation. Jake stood at the head of the table, uncomfortable with leadership but unwilling to let anyone else drive the conversation. He'd fought Comanche raiders, tracked killers through 3 territories, and stared down armed desperados, but public speaking made his palms sweat. "Most of you know why we're here," Jake began, his voice gruff but carrying clearly in the confined space. "Cyrus Blackwood has purchased Sarah Mitchell's mortgage and is moving to foreclose. On the surface, that's her problem, not yours. But Blackwood isn't interested in ranching. He's a speculator, and he sees water rights as his real profit opportunity. Once he owns the Mitchell property, he controls the creek that flows through half your lands during summer." A murmur ran through the assembled ranchers, a mix of concern and skepticism. Walt Henderson, who owned the second-largest spread in the valley, spoke up in his characteristic blunt manner. "That creek's been open water for 30 years, Apache. There's precedent water law that protects downstream users. Blackwood can't just cut us off." Jake had anticipated this objection. He and Benjamin Porter had spent hours researching the legal realities. Water law in Arizona Territory is complicated and constantly changing. The Mitchell property has riparian rights as the source landowner. Blackwood could argue that he's entitled to full use of water originating on his land before allowing downstream flow. Even if he's ultimately wrong, litigation could take years and cost more than any of us can afford. Meanwhile, your cattle are dying of thirst. Porter stood up, swaying slightly but coherent enough to add his professional opinion. "Jake's right. I've seen Blackwood's operation in New Mexico Territory. He purchased a property with spring rights and immediately started charging neighboring ranchers for access. Bankrupted 3 families before the territorial court ruled against him, and by then he'd already made back his investment. The man understands that possession is 9/10 of the law, and he's willing to exploit that edge." The mood in the room shifted, concern deepening into anger. These were hard men who'd built their ranches through backbreaking labor and survived droughts, floods, and Apache raids. The idea of some eastern speculator controlling their water access touched a nerve deeper than sympathy for Sarah's financial troubles. This was about independence, about the fundamental Western principle that a man's sweat equity in the land mattered more than legal maneuvering. Tom Garrett, a lean-weathered rancher who'd been in the valley longer than anyone, cleared his throat. "What exactly are you proposing, Apache? We all feel for Mrs. Mitchell's situation, but most of us are barely scraping by ourselves. I don't have $1,500 lying around to pay off her mortgage, and I'm guessing nobody else here does either." Sarah stood, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of speaking in front of so many skeptical men. "I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Garrett. I know I got myself into this situation through bad luck and poor management after Thomas died. But Jake's right, that Blackwood is everyone's problem. What I'm proposing is a cooperative arrangement if enough ranchers are willing to invest small amounts. Together we could raise the money to satisfy the mortgage. In return, I'll grant permanent water rights to every contributing property, legally documented and recorded with the territorial government." The proposal hung in the air while the ranchers digested its implications. It was a creative solution, turning Sarah's desperation into a community asset. By spreading the cost across multiple properties and guaranteeing water access in perpetuity, everyone gained security against future speculation. Jake watched the men calculate, seeing the shift from skepticism to cautious interest on several faces. "How much would each ranch need to contribute?" Henderson asked, his tone suggesting he was already doing the math. "And what happens if we can't raise the full amount? I'm not throwing good money after bad if this plan falls apart halfway through." Jake had anticipated this too. Based on 17 ranches contributing, we're looking at roughly $90 per property, with Sarah and I covering the remaining balance. Porter will hold all contributions in escrow if we don't reach the full amount by the foreclosure deadline. Everyone gets their money back. The water rights agreement gets filed simultaneously with the mortgage satisfaction, so everything happens together or not at all. It was a substantial amount of money, more than some of these ranchers could easily spare, but far less than the cost of fighting Blackwood in court or hauling water during drought season. Jake saw calculation and concern warring on weathered faces, men weighing their suspicion of collective action against their practical need for water security. Western individualism made cooperation difficult, but Western pragmatism recognized when self-interest aligned with the common good. The debate stretched for over an hour, voices rising and falling as objections were raised and addressed. Some ranchers remained skeptical, arguing that Blackwood might not actually interfere with water access, that they shouldn't reward Sarah's poor financial management, but gradually a consensus emerged. The risk of inaction outweighed the cost of collaboration, and the water rights agreement provided tangible value beyond simple charity. When Porter finally called for a show of hands, 14 of the 17 ranchers voted to participate. 3 held out, including Walt Henderson, whose skepticism about collective action ran deeper than his concern about water, but the majority was enough. Jake felt tension drain from his shoulders as he realized they'd actually pulled it off. $90 from 14 ranches, plus his own savings and whatever Sarah could scrape together, would total enough to satisfy the mortgage with a small buffer for unexpected costs. As the meeting broke up, ranchers came forward to shake Jake's hand or clap him on the shoulder, their respect evident even if some remained personally reserved. Sarah was surrounded by a smaller group offering encouragement and practical advice about ranch management. Jake watched her navigate the attention with grace, answering questions honestly about her financial struggles while maintaining her dignity. He felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. This woman had earned her place in this community, and he'd be damned if Blackwood or anyone else would take it from her. Walt Henderson approached Jake on his way out, his expression thoughtful rather than hostile. "I didn't vote for your plan, Apache, but I hope it works. Just understand that if Blackwood's the kind of man you say he is, he won't take this lying down. You're about to make yourself a target, and Mrs. Mitchell along with you. I hope you're prepared for what comes next." The warning was genuine, and Jake accepted it with a nod. "I've been a target before, Walt. Comes with the territory." He paused, then added with deliberate honesty, "But you're right to be concerned. Blackwood's not just going to accept defeat. Things might get rough before they get better." Henderson studied him for a long moment, then surprised Jake by extending his hand. "You're doing right by that woman, whatever your motivations. That counts for something in my book. If things do get rough, come find me. I may not have voted for collective property ownership, but I don't tolerate bullies either." With that, the old rancher walked out, leaving Jake to absorb the unexpected offer of support. Porter was already setting up the escrow account, meticulously recording each rancher's commitment and collecting initial payments from those who'd brought cash. Sarah joined Jake near the bar, her eyes shining with tears she was too proud to shed publicly. "We did it," she whispered, and Jake heard the wonder in her voice. "I didn't think it was possible, but we actually did it." Jake wanted to pull her into his arms, to share the moment of triumph properly, but the crowded saloon wasn't the place for public displays that would fuel gossip. Instead, he settled for squeezing her hand briefly, letting his touch convey what words couldn't. "This is just the first step," he cautioned, not wanting to diminish her joy, but needing her to understand the reality. "We've got the money to pay off the mortgage, but Blackwood's not going to walk away quietly. He'll look for another angle, another way to get what he wants." Sarah's expression sobered, the momentary euphoria giving way to steely determination. "Let him try. We've got the law on our side now and the community backing us up." "That's more than I had 3 days ago," she paused, then added quietly, "More than I've had since Thomas died, if I'm being honest." They left the saloon together, stepping out into the cool night air. The street was quiet, most of the town already asleep, but Jake's instincts prickled with awareness. He'd learned during the war to trust those instincts, the sense that something wasn't quite right even when nothing obvious appeared wrong. His hand dropped to his gun as he scanned the shadows, looking for whatever had triggered his internal alarm. The shot came from the rooftop across the street, the muzzle flashed bright in the darkness. Jake heard the bullet crack past his head, close enough to feel the displacement of air, and reacted on pure combat reflex. He tackled Sarah to the ground, covering her body with his own as 2 more shots rang out. Glass shattered in the saloon window behind them, and men inside started shouting. Jake drew his gun and returned fire toward the rooftop, not expecting to hit anything but needing to suppress the shooter long enough to get Sarah to safety. He dragged her toward the water trough, using it as cover while his mind raced through options. The shots had been deliberate, aimed to kill, and the positioning suggested someone with military training. This wasn't random violence or drunken mischief, it was an assassination attempt, and Jake had no doubt who'd ordered it. Blackwood had responded to their organizing effort faster and more viciously than expected. More gunfire erupted from inside the saloon as ranchers poured into the street armed and angry. The shooter on the rooftop retreated, and Jake heard the sound of running footsteps and a horse galloping away. He helped Sarah to her feet, checking her for injuries with hands that trembled slightly from adrenaline. "Are you hurt?" His voice came out rough, barely controlled fury making his words harsh. Sarah shook her head, her face pale but composed. "I'm fine." "Jake, that was—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The reality of what had just happened too enormous to put into words. Someone had just tried to murder them in the middle of town, had fired on a crowded street where innocent people could have been killed. The rules of engagement had shifted dramatically, from legal maneuvering to open warfare. Tom Garrett approached with a group of armed ranchers, his weathered face grim. "Whoever that was, they're long gone. But I found this on the boardwalk." He held up a brass cartridge casing, the kind used in military rifles. "Whoever took those shots wasn't some amateur. They knew what they were doing." Jake examined the casing, confirming what his instincts had already told him. Blackwood's hired himself a professional. This changes everything. He looked at the assembled ranchers, seeing his own anger reflected on their faces. The attack hadn't just targeted him and Sarah, it had violated the town's peace, put everyone at risk. "We need to get the sheriff involved, make this official before Blackwood can spin some story about what happened here." But when they found Sheriff Marcus Webb at his office, the lawman's response was less supportive than Jake had hoped. Webb was a political creature, more concerned with maintaining order than pursuing justice, and he clearly didn't relish the idea of confronting a man with Blackwood's resources. "Look, Apache, I understand you're upset, but you don't have any proof Blackwood was behind this. Could have been anyone. You've made plenty of enemies over the years doing tracking work." Jake felt his temper flare. "This wasn't about old grudges, Marcus. The timing is too convenient, coming right after we organized against Blackwood's foreclosure. He's sending a message, trying to scare us into backing down." He leaned forward, putting steel into his voice. 3 shots were fired on Main Street. "If you won't investigate properly, I'll send a telegram to the territorial marshal and let him know our local law enforcement isn't interested in attempted murder." The threat had the desired effect. Webb's face flushed, but he nodded reluctantly. "Fine, I'll look into it. Ask around about strangers in town, see if anyone saw anything useful. But don't expect miracles, Jake. Men like Blackwood are careful about covering their tracks." He paused, then added with what might have been genuine concern, "You should watch yourself. Next time they might not miss." Sarah had remained quiet during the exchange, but as they left the sheriff's office, she finally spoke. "He's right, you know. They almost killed you tonight because you're helping me. Maybe you should step back. Let Porter handle the legal work from here on out." Her voice was steady, but Jake heard the fear underneath. Not fear for herself, but for him. Jake stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. The street was empty now, everyone having retreated to safety after the shooting, giving them a moment of privacy. "I'm not stepping back, Sarah. Not now, not ever. What happened tonight just proves that Blackwood sees us as a real threat. That means we're winning, and he's getting desperate." He touched her face gently, seeing the worry in her eyes. "I know you're scared. Hell, I'm scared too. But I meant what I said before. I'm not walking away from you. Whatever comes, we face it together." Sarah leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly as she absorbed his words. When she opened them again, something had shifted, fear giving way to resolve. "Together, then. But Jake, if anything happens to you because of me—" She couldn't finish the thought, couldn't voice the grief that already haunted her from losing Thomas. "Nothing's going to happen," Jake said with more confidence than he felt. "I've been dodging bullets most of my adult life. Blackwood's hired gun is good, but I'm better." He managed a tight smile. "Besides, now I've got something worth living for. That makes a man real careful about staying alive." They walked back to where Sarah's wagon waited, Jake's senses on high alert for any sign of additional threats. The night felt oppressive now, full of shadows that could hide assassins and danger that could strike without warning. He helped Sarah into the wagon, then made a decision. I'm following you home and staying until morning. No arguments. After what happened tonight, I'm not leaving you alone. Sarah didn't argue, which told Jake exactly how shaken she really was beneath her brave facade. They rode through the darkness in tense silence, every sound magnified by adrenaline and fear. When they finally reached her ranch, Jake did a thorough sweep of the property, checking the barn and outbuildings for signs of intrusion. Only when he was satisfied they were alone did he allow himself to relax slightly. Inside the small ranch house, Sarah made coffee with shaking hands while Jake checked the windows and doors, making sure everything was secured. The domestic normalcy of the moment felt surreal after the violence of the evening. When Sarah handed him a cup, their fingers touched, and suddenly they were in each other's arms, holding tight like drowning people clutching driftwood. I thought I'd lost you, Sarah whispered against his chest. When I heard that shot and saw you fall, her voice broke, and Jake felt wetness soaking through his shirt as she finally let the tears come. He held her through the storm of emotion, his own heart aching with the knowledge of how close they'd come to disaster. I'm here, he murmured into her hair. I'm alive, you're alive, and we're going to get through this. He pulled back enough to look at her face, using his thumbs to wipe away her tears. I love you, Sarah. I should have said it before, should have been brave enough to speak the truth instead of fighting myself. But I'm saying it now, I love you, and I'm going to keep you safe no matter what it takes. Sarah's breath caught, her eyes searching his face like she was trying to memorize every detail. I love you too, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've loved you for months, maybe from the first time you rode out here pretending you needed to check my fence line. I'm so tired of being alone, Jake, so tired of pretending I don't need anyone. They kissed then, tentative at first and then with growing passion, months of longing and denial finally breaking free. Jake felt the last of his defenses crumble, the Apache persona that had protected him for so long dissolving in the face of Sarah's warmth and need. This was what he'd been running from, not the risk of loss, but the overwhelming power of connection. The way loving someone made you vulnerable in ways no amount of skill or toughness could defend against. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jake forced himself to step back. I should sleep in the barn, he said reluctantly, knowing that Sarah's reputation was already damaged by his presence here. Spending the night in her house, even in separate rooms, would only fuel more gossip. But Sarah shook her head, her grip on his hand tightening. Stay, please, I don't care what people say, I need you close tonight. I need to know you're safe. The vulnerability in her admission broke through the last of Jake's resistance. He nodded and let her lead him to the small parlor, where they spent the night curled together on the settee, fully clothed but wrapped in each other's arms, finding comfort and safety in simple proximity. As dawn broke, Jake lay awake listening to Sarah's breathing, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest. The battle with Blackwood was far from over. In fact, last night's assassination attempt suggested it was only beginning. But lying here with this woman in his arms, Jake found himself not regretting the fight ahead, but grateful for the chance to fight for something that mattered. The Apache in him was still there, still watchful and dangerous, but now that lethal edge had a purpose beyond simple survival. He had someone to protect, someone to build a future with, and he'd be damned if he let Blackwood or anyone else take that away. The attempted assassination changed everything and nothing simultaneously. In the days following the shooting, Redemption Springs hummed with tension as residents took sides in what was increasingly being called the Mitchell affair. Some viewed Sarah as a victim deserving protection, while others whispered that a respectable widow shouldn't have gotten herself into financial trouble or taken up with a dangerous man like Apache Thornton. Jake heard the gossip and ignored it, focused instead on the practical problems of keeping Sarah alive long enough to complete the mortgage payoff. Benjamin Porter worked with frantic energy, his usual drinking forgotten as he prepared the legal documents that would simultaneously satisfy Sarah's debt and establish the water rights cooperative. The escrow account had filled quickly after the shooting. Nothing motivated ranchers quite like a demonstration of Blackwood's ruthlessness. Even Walt Henderson had grudgingly contributed his $90, motivated more by stubborn independence than sympathy, but helpful nonetheless. Jake moved his few belongings to Sarah's ranch, abandoning any pretense of maintaining separate residences. The proprieties be damned, he couldn't protect her from his cabin 5 miles away, and after the shooting, Sarah didn't protest his constant presence. They fell into an easy domestic rhythm that felt both natural and surreal. Jake would check the property each morning, riding the fence line and looking for signs of intrusion, while Sarah managed the daily operations of the ranch. In the evenings, they'd plan strategy over dinner, their conversations mixing tactical concerns with the tentative explorations of two people learning to be vulnerable with each other. Blackwood remained conspicuously absent from town, though his hired man, a lean snake of a person named Dalton Reed, made regular appearances to remind everyone of the approaching foreclosure deadline. Reed was known throughout the territory as a fixer, a man who specialized in making inconvenient problems disappear through intimidation, violence, or whatever methods proved necessary. Jake had crossed paths with men like Reed before, though never this particular specimen. They were predators who'd learned to operate within the gray areas of the law, always careful to maintain deniability while doing their employer's dirty work. Jake was shoeing a horse in Sarah's barn when Reed finally made his move, approaching with exaggerated casualness and a smile that never reached his eyes. "Apache Thornton," Reed drawled, leaning against a fence post like they were old friends catching up. "Heard you've been playing rancher out here." Quite a change from tracking outlaws and collecting bounties. Jake continued his work, not bothering to look up. "What do you want, Reed?" He kept his tone neutral, but his body was coiled and ready. Men like Reed didn't make social calls, they came with messages, usually the threatening kind. "Mr. Blackwood asked me to extend an offer," Reed said, examining his fingernails with affected boredom. "He's willing to forgive Mrs. Mitchell's entire debt if she agrees to sell him a permanent easement for water rights across her property. Very generous terms, really. She gets to keep her land, he gets guaranteed water access. Everyone wins." Jake straightened, meeting Reed's eyes directly. The offer was designed to sound reasonable, but the implications were clear. An easement would give Blackwood control over who could access Redemption Creek, effectively allowing him to monopolize the water supply without owning the actual land. It was the same result he'd sought through foreclosure, just achieved through different means. Sarah's not interested in any deals with Blackwood. "The mortgage will be satisfied in full within 2 weeks, and this whole situation goes away." Reed's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "See, that's where things get complicated. Mr. Blackwood has concerns about the legitimacy of your little cooperative scheme. He's considering filing an objection with the territorial court, claiming that the escrow arrangement constitutes an illegal conspiracy to defraud a legitimate creditor. Could tie things up in litigation for months, maybe years." The threat was barely veiled. Blackwood had the resources to drag out legal proceedings indefinitely, bleeding Sarah dry with attorney fees while preventing the mortgage from being satisfied. Jake felt rage simmer in his gut, but he kept his expression neutral. Men like Reed fed on shows of emotion, looking for weaknesses to exploit. "Benjamin Porter's a licensed attorney. Everything we've done is completely legal. Blackwood can file whatever objections he wants, but they won't hold up in court." "Maybe not," Reed conceded with a shrug. "But legal and practical are different things, aren't they? A woman alone, trying to run a ranch while fighting expensive litigation? That's a hard row to hoe. Accidents happen on ranches, cattle get spooked, equipment fails, fires start in dry seasons. Would be a shame if Mrs. Mitchell got hurt trying to maintain a property she can't afford to keep." Jake moved before conscious thought could intervene, his hand fisting in Reed's shirt as he slammed the smaller man against the barn wall hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. "Listen very carefully," Jake said, his voice quiet and deadly. "You just threatened a woman under my protection. That means the next time I see you within a mile of this property, I won't bother with conversation. I'll just start shooting and explain to the sheriff afterward. Are we clear?" Reed's eyes widened, genuine fear flickering across his face before training reasserted control. "You can't threaten me, Thornton. I've got witnesses who will say I came here peaceful and you assaulted me without provocation," but his voice wavered slightly, the professional menace undermined by the very real danger radiating from Jake's barely controlled fury. Jake released him with a shove that sent Reed stumbling. "Get off this property?" Tell Blackwood that Sarah Mitchell isn't for sale, her land isn't for sale, and if he sends you or anyone else here again with threats, I'll consider it an act of war and respond accordingly." He let his hand rest on his gun, the gesture deliberate and clear. "I've killed better men than you for lesser reasons, Reed. Don't test whether I'm bluffing." Reed straightened his clothing with shaking hands, his composure badly rattled. "You're making a mistake, Apache. Blackwood always gets what he wants, always." He backed toward his horse, keeping his eyes on Jake like a man retreating from a dangerous animal. "This isn't over." "Not by a long shot." Jake watched him ride away, his pulse pounding with adrenaline and anger. He knew he'd just escalated the conflict, transformed it from a legal battle into something far more dangerous. But Reed's veiled threats against Sarah had triggered something primal in him, a protective instinct that overrode tactical considerations. The Apache might have handled it differently, calculated the strategic implications, and played things cooler. But the man who loved Sarah Mitchell couldn't tolerate threats against her, regardless of the consequences. Sarah emerged from the house as Reed disappeared over the ridge, concern etched on her features. She'd obviously heard at least part of the confrontation. What did he want? She asked, though Jake suspected she already knew the answer. He explained Reed's offer and the implied threats, watching Sarah's expression harden with each detail. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring toward the creek that ran through her property, the water source that made this land valuable enough to fight over. "I won't give in," she finally said, her voice steel wrapped in velvet. "Thomas died building this ranch, and I won't let some speculator steal it through intimidation. If Blackwood wants a war, then that's what he'll get." Jake pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "War is exactly what we'll get," he said quietly. "Reed will report back to Blackwood, and things are going to escalate quickly. We need to be ready for anything legal challenges, more violence, maybe both simultaneously." He pulled back to look at her seriously. "I want you to stay in town for the next few days, maybe with the pastor's family." "It's not safe here." Sarah shook her head stubbornly. "This is my home, Jake. I won't be driven away from it. If Blackwood sends his thugs, we'll face them together." She touched his face gently, her eyes soft, despite the hard words. "I know you're trying to protect me, and I love you for it. But I'm not some fragile thing that needs to be locked away for safekeeping. We're partners in this, remember?" Jake wanted to argue, to insist on keeping her somewhere secure, but he recognized the futility. Sarah had survived her husband's death, near poverty and social isolation through sheer stubborn will. She wasn't going to start hiding now, regardless of the danger. "Then we fortify," he said, shifting to tactical mode. "We set up warning systems, make sure we can see anyone approaching from a distance. I'll teach you to shoot properly if you don't already know how. And we let the other ranchers know what Reed said, make sure everyone understands this isn't just about you anymore." Over the next several days, Jake transformed Sarah's ranch into something resembling a military position. He strung tripwires connected to bells at strategic approaches, cleared sight lines to eliminate cover for potential attackers, and positioned rifles at multiple locations throughout the property. Sarah proved to be a capable student, her shooting improving rapidly under Jake's instruction. They fell into a routine of watchfulness, taking turns on guard duty through the nights, learning to sleep light and wake at any unusual sound. Tom Garrett and several other ranchers rode out to offer support, bringing additional guns and offering to establish a rotation of guards. The community was rallying, transformed from collection of individuals into something resembling a unified force. Blackwood's threats had backfired, creating solidarity instead of fear. Jake felt gratitude for the backing, though he knew the real test was still coming. It arrived on a moonless night 10 days after Reed's visit. Jake was on watch, sitting in the darkness outside the ranch house, when his instincts prickled with warning. He couldn't see or hear anything specific, but years of survival had taught him to trust the feeling that something was wrong. He moved quietly to wake Sarah, putting a finger to her lips to signal silence. She nodded understanding and reached for the rifle they kept beside the bed. They positioned themselves at opposite windows, watching and waiting. Minutes stretched into an hour, tension building with each passing moment. Then Jake caught movement near the barn, just a shadow darker than the surrounding night, but enough to confirm his suspicions. He counted 4, maybe 5 men moving with trained precision, spreading out to surround the house. These weren't simple ranch hands or local toughs. This was a coordinated assault by professionals. Jake made a decision in the space of a heartbeat. Fighting from inside the house meant being trapped if they set fire to it, which seemed the most likely plan. Better to take the initiative, use surprise and darkness as weapons. He squeezed Sarah's shoulder, their prearranged signal, and she immediately doused the single lamp burning in the kitchen. Complete darkness flooded the house. Jake moved through the blackness with practiced ease, his eyes long adjusted to the night. He slipped out the back door and circled wide, coming at the attackers from an unexpected angle. He could see them more clearly now, 5 men, all armed, moving toward the house with obvious intent to breach and burn. Reed was among them, directing the others with hand signals. The Apache and Jake took over completely, years of tracking and combat experience channeling into cold efficiency. He moved like a ghost, using the terrain he'd memorized during days of preparation. His first shot took down the man carrying what looked like a can of kerosene, the report shattering the night silence and transforming stealth into chaos. The attackers scattered, returning fire toward the muzzle flash, but Jake was already moving. Gunfire erupted from the house as Sarah engaged targets from her position, her shooting more accurate than Jake had hoped. The attackers found themselves caught in a crossfire, their planned assault turned into a desperate fight. Jake heard Reed shouting orders, trying to rally his men, but the element of surprise was gone and with it their advantage. One of the attackers rushed Jake's position and they went down in a tangle of limbs and violence. Jake fought dirty, using knees and elbows and anything else that could hurt. His opponent was skilled, probably former military, but desperation and fury gave Jake an edge. He got his hands around the man's throat and squeezed until the struggling stopped, then grabbed the fallen man's rifle and rejoined the fight. The battle lasted maybe 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. When the shooting finally stopped, 3 of the attackers lay wounded or dead, and the remaining 2, including Reed, were fleeing into the darkness, abandoning their mission and their casualties. Jake wanted to pursue, to finish this permanently, but he couldn't leave Sarah alone with wounded enemies and potential reinforcements. He returned to the house to find Sarah unharmed but shaking with adrenaline, her rifle still trained on the front door. They checked the bodies together, finding 1 dead and 2 critically wounded. Jake sent Sarah to fetch Tom Garrett and the sheriff while he kept watch over the survivors, his mind already working through the implications of what had just happened. Sheriff Webb arrived with the dawn, his expression grim as he surveyed the carnage. The wounded men were taken into custody, and the dead man was identified as a known criminal from New Mexico with outstanding warrants for armed robbery. Under questioning, one of the wounded men broke quickly, admitting that Dalton Reed had hired them to burn Sarah's ranch and make it look like an accident. He didn't implicate Blackwood directly, but the connection was obvious enough. "This gives us grounds to arrest Reed," Webb said, showing more backbone than Jake had expected. "Maybe even Blackwood as an accessory. But you know how this works. Apache men like Blackwood have expensive lawyers who'll drag out any trial for years. The wounded men might recant their statements, claim they were coerced. It's not the clean win you're hoping for." Jake knew the sheriff was right, but at least the immediate threat had been neutralized. "Reed's finished in this territory regardless," Jake said. "Word will spread about tonight. Nobody's going to hire a fixer who gets his men killed and runs from a fight." He looked at the ranch house, seeing new bullet holes in the walls, evidence of how close they'd come to disaster. "What about Blackwood? Can you at least bring him in for questioning?" Webb shook his head slowly. "Blackwood left town 3 days ago, supposedly on business in Santa Fe. Convenient timing, gives him an alibi. He'll claim he had no knowledge of Reed's actions, that his employee went rogue. Without direct evidence linking him to tonight's attack, I can't touch him." The sheriff paused, then added more quietly, "But between you and me, I'd watch my back. Men like Blackwood don't forget being humiliated." "This isn't over." As Webb and his deputies hauled away the prisoners, Jake stood with Sarah in the growing light, surveying the damage to her property. They'd won this round, survived an assassination attempt, and prevented her ranch from burning. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they'd only delayed the inevitable confrontation with Blackwood. Men with that much money and pride didn't accept defeat gracefully. They adapted, evolved their tactics, and came back harder. Sarah leaned against him, exhaustion finally overwhelming the adrenaline that had kept her functioning through the night. "How much longer?" she asked softly. "How much longer do we have to keep fighting?" Jake wrapped his arms around her, wishing he had a better answer. "Until we finish what we started. The mortgage payment is due in 4 days. Once that's satisfied and the water rights agreement is filed, Blackwood loses his legal leverage. Maybe then he'll cut his losses and move on." He didn't really believe it, but he needed Sarah to have hope, needed her to believe that an end was in sight. They spent the day repairing damage and reinforcing defenses, knowing that despite Webb's arrests, danger remained. Other ranchers rode out to offer support, forming an impromptu guard rotation that ensured the property was never left unprotected. The community had transformed from neutral observers into active participants, their self-interest now clearly aligned with Sarah's survival. Jake found himself grateful for the solidarity even as he worried about bringing more people into the line of fire. War had a way of expanding, pulling in bystanders, and turning private conflicts into community affairs. He'd seen it during the Civil War, watched disputes over principle escalate into wholesale slaughter. He didn't want that for Redemption Springs, but he was beginning to suspect the choice might not be his to make. As night fell again, Jake and Sarah sat together on the porch, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of fire. Despite the violence and danger, Jake felt strangely at peace. He'd spent so many years running from connection, convinced that isolation was safety. But sitting here with Sarah, defending something worth protecting, he finally understood what he'd been missing. The fear of loss would never go away, but it was balanced now by the knowledge that life without love wasn't really living at all. It was just existing, just marking time until death claimed you anyway. 4 more days? Sarah said quietly, echoing his earlier words. Then we win, Jake squeezed her hand, hoping she was right, but preparing for the reality that victory might require more blood before it was finally earned. The Apache in him was already planning for contingencies, thinking 3 moves ahead like the hunter he'd always been. Only now, he wasn't hunting prey, he was protecting something infinitely more precious. And he'd do whatever it took to keep it safe. The final 4 days before the mortgage payment deadline crawled past with agonizing slowness, each hour weighted with anticipation and dread. Jake barely slept, his body trained for crisis, but his mind refusing to settle. Benjamin Porter had completed all the legal documentation, every page scrutinized for potential challenges. The escrow funds were ready for transfer, the water rights cooperative agreement drafted and awaiting simultaneous filing with the Territorial Land Office. On paper, everything was perfect. But Jake had lived long enough to know that paper meant nothing when men with guns decided to ignore it. Cyrus Blackwood returned to Redemption Springs on the morning of the deadline, arriving in a fancy carriage accompanied by 2 lawyers from Santa Fe and a new contingent of hired security legitimate ranch hands this time. Not obvious criminals like Reed had recruited. The speculator's message was clear. He was operating within the law now, presenting himself as a respectable businessman rather than a violent intimidator. Jake watched from Porter's office window as Blackwood established himself at the hotel, playing the role of patient creditor waiting to collect his due. "He's planning something," Jake muttered, his instincts screaming warnings he couldn't quite articulate. "This is too calm, too civilized. After everything that's happened, he should be furious. Instead, he's acting like he's already won." Porter shuffled through papers nervously, his sobriety of recent weeks giving way to visible anxiety. "The law is on our side, Jake. We've got the money, we've got the documentation, and we've got witnesses to the payment. Even if Blackwood objects, there's no legal basis to refuse satisfaction of the debt." But the lawyer's hands trembled slightly as he organized files, betraying doubts his words tried to conceal. Sarah arrived at noon, dressed in her best Sunday clothes and carrying herself with quiet dignity. Jake felt his heart clench watching her walk down Main Street, head high despite the stares and whispers that followed her progress. She'd endured so much: the loss of her husband, financial ruin, assassination attempts, and a community that judged her for having the audacity to survive, yet here she was, ready to claim victory through sheer stubborn will. He met her at Porter's office door, wanting to touch her reassuringly, but settling for a slight nod that communicated volumes. "At precisely 1 o'clock?" They walked together to the land office where the transaction would be officially recorded. Blackwood was already there with his lawyers, his expression pleasant and professional in a way that made Jake's skin crawl. Men didn't smile like that unless they held cards nobody else could see. Tom Garrett and Walt Henderson had come as witnesses, along with several other ranchers whose money had made this moment possible. The small office felt crowded and tense, too many badas and competing agendas pressed into inadequate space. The territorial clerk, a nervous man named Finch who clearly wanted no part of this dispute, began the formal proceedings. Porter presented the escrow documentation showing the full mortgage amount plus accrued interest, and fees $1,547, every penny accounted for. He laid out the bank drafts and cash in neat stacks on the desk, a fortune in currency that represented the collective effort of an entire community. Blackwood's senior lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Covington, examined the money with theatrical thoroughness before speaking. Mr. Blackwood is prepared to accept payment, but he has concerns about the source of these funds. Specifically, he questions whether the so-called water rights cooperative constitutes an improper collusive arrangement designed to defraud his legitimate business interests. Jake felt Sarah stiffen beside him, her carefully maintained composure threatening to crack. Porter responded quickly, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. "There is no fraud, Mr. Covington. Multiple property owners have voluntarily pooled resources to purchase a legitimate asset permanent water rights which incidentally allows Mrs. Mitchell to satisfy her debt. This is standard business practice, no different from partners forming a company or investors backing a commercial venture." Covington smiled coldly. "Perhaps, but my client has the right to refuse payment if he believes the funds are tainted by illegality. We're therefore requesting a 30-day continuance to investigate the propriety of this arrangement. If everything proves legitimate, Mr. Blackwood will gladly accept payment at that time." The trap snapped shut with perfect legal precision. 30 more days meant 30 more days of vulnerability. 30 more days for Blackwood to intimidate witnesses or manufacture evidence of impropriety. 30 more days where accidents could happen and people could get hurt. Jake saw the strategy now. Blackwood wasn't refusing payment outright, which would have clear legal consequences. He was simply requesting reasonable time to verify the legitimacy of an unusual transaction. Any judge would likely grant such a request, and the battle would start all over again. Jake watched Sarah's face drain of color as the implications sank in. They'd come so close, fought so hard, and now victory was being snatched away by legal maneuvering. He felt his own rage building, the Apache part of him calculating how many shots it would take to permanently remove Blackwood from the equation. His hand drifted toward his gun, not consciously but as automatic response to threat. Then Sarah did something extraordinary. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tense silence with surprising strength. "Mr. Blackwood, you and I both know this isn't about legal propriety. You want my land because it controls water access, and you're willing to use any tactic, legal or otherwise, to get it. You've hired men to intimidate me, to shoot at me, to burn my home, and now you're hiding behind lawyers and procedure because direct methods failed." Blackwood's mask of civility slipped slightly, irritation flickering across his features. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand you're emotional about losing your property, but making wild accusations—" "I'm not finished," Sarah interrupted, her voice gaining power. "You think I'm just some widow you can push around, that I'll eventually break and give you what you want. But you've made a critical miscalculation. You've turned this into a community fight instead of a personal one. Every person in this room has invested in keeping my land out of your hands, not because they care about me necessarily, but because they care about their own water access and independence." She turned to address the gathered ranchers, her eyes blazing with conviction. "Gentlemen, if Mr. Blackwood succeeds in delaying this payment, he sets a precedent. Any of you could be next. He'll buy your debts, question your business arrangements, tie you up in legal proceedings until you're bankrupt. The question isn't whether I keep my land. It's whether we allow one man to control this entire valley through financial manipulation." Walt Henderson, who'd been skeptical of the cooperative from the start, surprised everyone by speaking up. "The lady's got a point, Blackwood. You've shown your hand too clearly. We all know what you're after, and we're not inclined to let you have it." He looked at the territorial clerk directly. Finch, is there any legitimate legal reason you can't accept this payment right now? The clerk squirmed uncomfortably, caught between competing pressures. Well, technically, if the creditor raises concerns about the source of funds, he trailed off under Henderson's hard stare. That's not what I asked, Henderson pressed. I asked if there's a legitimate legal reason. The money's real, the amount is correct, and it's being offered before the deadline. Seems to me that satisfies the contract, regardless of Mr. Blackwood's concerns about how Mrs. Mitchell raised the funds. Tom Garrett added his voice to the pressure. We're all witnesses here that payment was offered in good faith and on time. If Blackwood refuses it, seems to me he's the one acting in bad faith, not Mrs. Mitchell. Jake watched the dynamic shift, saw Blackwood's lawyers conferring in urgent whispers. The speculator had overplayed his hand, made the dispute too public and too obvious. His strategy required operating in legal gray areas where intimidation and procedural delays could work quietly. But Sarah had transformed this into a moment of public accountability, forcing everyone present to choose sides openly. Blackwood's expression hardened as he recognized the trap. If he pushed too hard on refusing payment, he risked a legal ruling that would damage his reputation across the territory. Other banks and property owners would become wary of selling him debt if they believed he manipulated foreclosure proceedings unfairly. His business model depended on maintaining at least a veneer of legitimate operations. This is highly irregular, Covington protested, trying to regain control of the situation. My client has the right. Your client has the right to accept payment or refuse it, Porter interrupted, showing unexpected backbone. But if he refuses payment offered in good faith before the deadline, that constitutes clear bad faith under territorial contract law. Mrs. Mitchell would have grounds to sue for damages, including legal fees and the costs of this entire proceedings. And I'd be happy to pursue that case all the way to the Territorial Supreme Court if necessary. The threat was real and Covington knew it. Blackwood's entire operation depended on legal leverage, on being the one filing suits rather than defending them. A lengthy court battle where his tactics would be exposed to judicial scrutiny was the last thing he wanted. Jake saw the calculation happening behind Blackwood's eyes, saw the moment when cost-benefit analysis overrode pride and stubbornness. Fine, Blackwood said abruptly, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. Accept the payment, Finch. Clearly Mrs. Mitchell has friends willing to aid her questionable financial arrangements. But don't think this is over, he added, looking directly at Sarah with undisguised malice. I have other interests in this territory, other properties I'm pursuing. We'll cross paths again, I guarantee it. The threat hung in the air for a moment before Jake stepped forward, positioning himself between Blackwood and Sarah. Mr. Blackwood, I need to be very clear about something. Sarah Mitchell is under my permanent protection. If you or anyone associated with you comes near her or her property again, I won't bother with lawyers or sheriffs. I'll handle it personally, and I'm very good at handling problems permanently. Are we understanding each other? The room went silent, everyone recognizing the naked threat for what it was. Blackwood met Jake's eyes, and whatever he saw there made him step back slightly. Are you threatening me, Mr. Thornton, in front of all these witnesses? I'm making a promise, Jake said quietly, his Apache tone fully present. The same promise I've made to every outlaw I've tracked, every man who thought he could escape consequences through money or connections. You've tried to kill Sarah twice now. There won't be a third time, because if you try again, I'll assume you're an immediate deadly threat and respond accordingly. That's not a threat, it's information about how the world works when you come after people I love. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, predator recognizing predator. Then Blackwood turned away with obvious disdain. Complete the transaction, Covington. Let's not waste more time in this provincial backwater. He walked out without another word, his lawyers scrambling to follow. The tension broke like a snapped wire. Finch completed the paperwork with shaking hands, officially recording the mortgage satisfaction and filing the water rights cooperative agreement simultaneously. Sarah signed documents in a daze, barely comprehending that the nightmare was finally over. When the last signature was placed and the official stamps applied, a spontaneous cheer erupted from the gathered ranchers. Jake pulled Sarah into his arms, not caring any more about propriety or gossip. She was trembling, shock and relief overwhelming her careful control. "It's done," he whispered against her hair. "You did it. You saved your ranch." Sarah pulled back to look at him, tears streaming down her face but her smile radiant. "We did it. I couldn't have survived this without you, Jake. Without all of you," she added, looking at the ranchers who'd risked their own money to support her fight. The celebration moved to the Last Chance Saloon, where drinks flowed freely and the story of Sarah's victory was told and retold with increasing embellishment. Jake stayed close to her side, accepting congratulations and backslaps with his usual reserve but allowing himself to feel genuine happiness for the first time in recent memory. They'd won. Against considerable odds and real danger, they'd actually won. As evening fell and the party continued, Jake and Sarah slipped away, walking together through the quiet streets of Redemption Springs. The desert air was cool and clear, stars emerging in impossible profusion overhead. They ended up at Sarah's ranch, standing together looking at the land that had cost so much to keep. "What happens now?" Sarah asked quietly, leaning against Jake's solid warmth. "Blackwood's gone, the mortgage is paid, and I'm suddenly free for the first time since Thomas died. I don't quite know what to do with that freedom." Jake considered the question carefully, aware that his answer mattered more than casual conversation. "Now we build something," he said finally. "You've got a ranch that needs work, and I've got skills beyond tracking and shooting. We could expand the herd, improve the infrastructure, maybe even prove that this land is good for more than just surviving." He paused, gathering courage for what he wanted to say next. "If you want a partner in that work, I'm volunteering." Sarah turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "Jake Thornton, are you proposing a business arrangement or something more personal?" Jake felt his heart hammering. The same nervousness he'd felt facing armed opponents, but somehow more intense. "I'm saying I love you, Sarah Mitchell. I'm saying that fighting to save your ranch made me realize I don't want to go back to being alone. I'm saying that if you'll have me, I want to build a life here with you, proper and legal and permanent. Are you asking me to marry you?" Sarah's voice wavered between hope and disbelief. "I suppose I am," Jake admitted, feeling awkward but determined. "I know I'm not much of a catch a middle-aged gunfighter with more SCARS than assets and a reputation that'll always make some folks nervous. But I'll work hard, I'll keep you safe, and I'll love you for whatever time we're given. That's the best offer I can make." Sarah laughed, the sound bright and joyful in the darkness. "Jake, you're the best man I've ever known. Yes, I'll marry you." 1,000 times yes. She pulled him down for a kiss that tasted like tears and laughter and promises finally spoken. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Redemption Springs, with half the valley in attendance. Even Walt Henderson came, his skepticism about romance apparently outweighed by respect for two people who'd fought hell itself to be together. Benjamin Porter served as Jake's best man, sober for the occasion and quietly proud of his role in their victory. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, two people who'd found each other late in life making promises they intended to keep. The months that followed brought the hard work of building a working ranch and a functioning marriage. Jake discovered he liked ranching more than he'd expected, found satisfaction in work that created something rather than just tracking what was lost or broken. Sarah bloomed with happiness, her natural warmth no longer hidden behind widow's grief and financial worry. They had disagreements and difficult days, moments when old habits of independence clashed with new patterns of partnership. But they worked through conflicts with honest communication, learning to trust that love meant staying even when things got hard. Cyrus Blackwood never returned to Redemption Springs, his interests apparently shifting to opportunities elsewhere in the territory. Rumors circulated that Jake's very public threat had damaged the speculator's reputation, made him seem weak for backing down. Whatever the truth, the immediate danger had passed, allowing the community to focus on growth rather than survival. The water rights cooperative proved successful beyond initial expectations, creating a model that other communities adopted. Sarah's decision to share control of a valuable resource rather than monopolize it had transformed potential conflict into collaboration. The ranchers who'd contributed to saving her mortgage found that guaranteed water access improved their own property values and operational stability. Even those who'd been skeptical, like Henderson, eventually admitted that collective action had benefits individual stubbornness couldn't match. On a cool evening 6 months after their wedding, Jake and Sarah sat on the porch of their ranch house, no longer hers or his, but genuinely theirs, watching the sunset paint the desert in familiar shades of gold and crimson. Sarah's hand rested on the slight swell of her belly, where new life was taking root. The baby was unexpected, both of them having assumed that age and hard living had foreclosed that possibility. But life had a way of surprising people who'd stopped looking for miracles. "Are you happy?" Sarah asked, a question she'd developed a habit of asking because she genuinely wanted to know the answer. Jake considered the question honestly, measuring his current life against the lonely years that had preceded it. "Yeah," he said finally, surprised by how simple the truth was. "I spent so long thinking happiness meant not hurting, not risking loss. But being here with you, building something real, facing whatever comes together, this is better than safe ever was." Sarah squeezed his hand, her smile visible in the gathering dusk. "The widow who asked if you desired her got more than she bargained for," Jake laughed, remembering that pivotal moment when Sarah's whispered question had shattered his careful defenses. And the Apache who tried to turn away, fighting himself every step, discovered that the real fight wasn't against feelings but against fear of them. He pulled her close, feeling the rightness of her presence against his side. "I'm glad I lost that fight." They sat in comfortable silence as stars emerged overhead. Two people who'd found love late and hard-won, who'd fought for the right to build a future together. The desert wind carried scents of sage and possibility, the ranch around them quiet but alive with potential. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges, the endless demands of land and livestock. But tonight, in this moment, they had everything that mattered: each other, safety, hope, and the knowledge that they were exactly where they belonged. Jake, Apache Thornton, had spent most of his life running from connection, convinced that isolation was strength and vulnerability was weakness. It had taken a widow's courage, a community's support, and a battle against greed to teach him what he should have learned years earlier, that love wasn't the enemy of survival. It was the point of it. Fighting for something worth keeping. Risking everything for someone worth protecting. That was what made life more than just existence, what transformed surviving into truly living. And as he sat there with Sarah in his arms and their future growing inside her, Jake finally understood that he hadn't lost himself by letting her in. He'd found the parts of himself he'd buried after too much war and too much loss. The Apache would always be there, the dangerous edge that kept them safe. But he was more than just a weapon now. He was a husband, soon to be a father, a partner in building something that would outlast them both. The widow had whispered her question, and the Apache had turned away, fighting himself with every instinct and habit developed over 15 hard years. But in the end, love had proven stronger than fear. Connection more powerful than isolation, and the courage to be vulnerable had delivered rewards that safety never could. They'd won their battle against Blackwood, but more importantly, they'd won the harder fight against their own wounded hearts. As darkness completed its claim on the desert, and the first coyotes began their nightly chorus, Jake and Sarah went inside together, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring, secure in the knowledge that they would face it side by side. The fight was over, the real living was just beginning, and for two people who'd found each other against all odds and held on against every threat, that was the happiest ending imaginable.